Hi, I am Miss Roz, and today we are going to talk about the ingredient flour. Right, we'll talk about the functions as well as kind of the different types of flours that we have. Right, so functions. Right, so it provides kind of the main function for baked goods is to provide the backbone and the structure to those baked goods. However, there are some other things that it does for us. So it does help to generate that texture and appearance of baked goods. It contributes to the flavor, it provides some nutrition, and also acts as a binding and absorbing agent. Right? When we have flour, right, it typically comes from two different types of flour sources or wheat sources, I should say. Typically, it either comes from a hard wheat or a soft wheat. Right? So hard wheats come from the hard parts of the kernel, and it typically has a lower starch content and contains more protein. Whereas the soft wheat will come from the softer parts of the kernel and provide a higher starch content and contain less protein. Right. So common hard wheat flours are like bread or high protein flours. Common soft wheat are cake flour or pastry flour, right? But the most common types of flour that we use, just generally speaking, is going to be this all-purpose flour, and that's actually an equal part of hard wheat and soft wheat, and that's kind of what makes it all-purpose because it has some properties of the soft wheat and some properties of that hard wheat. But generally speaking, we typically see all-purpose flours in our like personal kitchens, but not necessarily bake shops. So when you get more into the commercial business of things, bake shops tend to get more specific in the types of flours they are going to use. So we have our bread protein or bread flour, or sometimes also known as high protein flour, and this is made from obviously hard wheat, right? And tends to have kind of more of like a granular texture when you touch it, right? And obviously, bread flours we're going to use more to make bread, hence the name, right? On the other hand, we have cake flour, which is made from that soft wheat, right? And tends to have a much like softer texture. Like if you were to kind of put it in your hands, it would be much softer and much smoother. And typically, cake flour tends to be very white in color, right? And so we tend to use cake flour um, to make cakes, again, hence the name. There's also pastry flour, which is also made from the soft wheat. But interestingly, it kind of has, it's closer to color of bread flour, which is more kind of like a lighter brown beigey color opposed to a very stark white color. But then it's also closer to all-purpose flour in the gluten strength. So it's kind of like a in between like a bread. It's kind of like in between all three of those um, in terms of different characteristics, right? But then we also have semolina flour, which you may or may not have heard of. Um, it, it, so we talked about how flours come from hard wheat or soft wheat, but there's actually a third type of category of wheat, which is called durum wheat, and that's where semolina flour comes from. And this is a very hard wheat, so much so that it's not able to be used for baked goods. But interestingly, they do sometimes use it for pasta because it has a very good sturdy structure to give to that pasta. So typically that's when we would use semolina flour. Right. Then the other flour we have is whole wheat, or sometimes known as graham flour, and this is milled from the entire wheat kernel. Right. So hard wheat and soft wheat breaks out the parts of the kernel, and you pull the hard wheat to one side, and then the hard kernels to one side and the soft kernels to the other, and that's how you make your flours. However, whole wheat takes the whole kernel, hard and soft, whatever it is, and breaks it and mills it down using both what we call the germ and the bran of the kernel. Right. Whole wheat flour does not last as long, and that's partially because in the wheat germ there is fat. There's a higher fat content in the wheat germ, and so it tends to spoil much quicker as a whole wheat flour than just a regular all-purpose or bread, cake, or pastry kind of flour. And then this is typically combined with some kind of other flour, so commonly with either bread or all-purpose flour, because it is much heavier than kind of your traditional flours. Because if you tried to make breads with 100% whole wheat flour, it would be very hard, very dense bread, right? But then the other question is that are there any other non-wheat flours, right, for those who can't eat the wheat, which there absolutely are. So some examples may be barley flour, buckwheat flour, corn or potato flour, rye flour, or soy flour, right? So those are kind of the basics of the types of flours that we can use. But as I said, in the kitchen, right, our general just at-home kitchens, we tend to use all-purpose flours unless you're very into baking and very kind of a big foodie kind of person. Right? So thank you so much for watching this flour lecture. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me during class. Thank you.